Welcome to Module 12. In the previous couple of chapters, in fact, we looked at the basics of what we'll call delivery or deployment of your project. We focused on the mechanics of writing a basic rule and then ensuring that it ended up somewhere on the server so that the end users could take advantage of it. In this chapter, we're going to look in a little more detail at how users and permissions, I've called them permissions, but we'll go into a little more detail in a moment, might affect the application as you build your policy model and might limit what you can do. All of this has good reason because we don't necessarily want one person to be doing everything. We would like to break it up into separate roles. So we'll be talking about roles as well. Okay, let's take a look at the agenda. In the world of Intelligent Advisor, there are actually two kinds of user, if I can put it like that. We have human users, which hopefully includes people like me, but we also have what's known as API clients. You can think of them as users who aren't human, who are essentially automation tools in some way. We'll give you a couple of specific examples where they're going to be very useful to you. In early versions of Intelligent Advisor, there wasn't a very clear-cut definition of what was a human and what wasn't a human. It's got a lot better now, as we'll see in the later demo, because we've split it into two separate screens. And permissions apply both to humans and non-humans, because we don't want people to run amok doing things that they shouldn't be. Of course, we need to look at how to create, manage, and edit users, essentially how we can change the roles that you have. I'm also going to talk about the connection between this concept of users and roles and actual day-to-day stuff. You know, if you're a person whose main job is to write policy models in Microsoft Word and then that's it, you need somebody else. You need somebody who has a different job to take the work that you've done and move it on. You can think of it like a process flow in a way. You're at the start of a process and there'll be somebody else, some other actor in the process who will pick up that work and decide what to do with it. Now, of course, if you're working on a small project, you may be both of those people, and that's okay too. But in the eyes of the Intelligent Advisor Hub, you will still need more than one role because each role has a clearly encapsulated set of things they're allowed to do. The fourth point, which is essentially a renaming of an existing feature, allows us to add more granularity, more detail to this concept of permission. For example, I have a colleague, Steve, who is sometimes a rule author. He writes policies. And in some other situations, he needs extra permissions. Well, we break that down by saying, well, imagine there were two folders, and Steve has one set of permissions on one folder and another set of permissions on another folder. So workspaces, at this stage, you can think of them like folders. They're a way to give us specific permissions on specific locations. Anyway, more detail. Back to basics. A user, well, let's put it this way. To be useful to an Oracle Intelligent Advisor project, anyone who collaborates in some way with the hub, or who writes policies, or who is responsible for deciding when we're going to release the work we've done to the end users, every one of those needs to have a clearly defined user in the Intelligent Advisor Hub. Of course, you may also have multiple hubs. You'll have a test hub, a development hub, a production hub, and so on. As of today, speaking in July 2020, there is no way to have a user who can access more than one hub. The notion of a user is connected to a hub. So you might have to get a little bit creative and start creating usernames like Richard_dev or Anna_admin to remind you, for example, that this user called Richard is the user for the development environment. Maybe there'll be another user called Richard_prod for the production environment, and so on. So you have to be a little bit kind of creative in that respect. The last point is the important one. Just creating a user doesn't really get you anywhere because a user needs permissions to be useful, and of course the user needs to have a password to be able to log in, and there's a whole bunch of admin we'll talk about in a minute. Switching back to this concept of humans and non-humans, much of what I just said in that previous slide applies to these non-human users. API clients are essentially limited role users. There's only certain things an API client can do. An API client cannot write policies, for example, because an API client is supposed to be a non-human, is supposed to be an automation feature. Typically, you'll find them wherever you find programmers, or wherever you find people who are in charge of the wider environment, who are involved in automated testing, who are involved in automated delivery or continuous development. These API clients will have a username, will have a password, and will have one or more roles, just like normal users, and they're managed on a separate page. So it comes down to this. To be in any way useful, your hub needs you to go and create, edit, and manage users. When you install Intelligent Advisor, or when it's instanced for you by Oracle, you will probably find that there's only one active user, a user called admin. And that user has basically been given enough permission to create other users. So it's almost like the seed behind everything else that you do. So there is one other user who is present in your brand new hub, but that user will be deactivated. It's just there for template purposes. You can use it if you wish. But the basic idea is you will need to log in as admin, and you will need to begin the process of creating, enabling, disabling, deleting, managing users. And if you don't give a user a role, there's really not much they can do. Just a word of advice, and we'll mention it again at the end of this chapter, is that we're going to cover off the big picture here. We're going to talk about the basic roles, the key functionality. But there is a big matrix, if you like, in the online documentation, which describes exactly which functionality is available to which role, so that you can go down to the nth level of detail if you need to. So, we've talked about creating a user, and we've stressed how important it is that a user has at least one role. Recently, the role names, the names that we give to these functions or this permission, have changed. And this is a good thing. They're slightly clearer than they were. They're certainly slightly shorter, so the names are easier to remember. But it means that if you're moving from an earlier version, so if you're coming from 19C perhaps and you're upgrading to 20A or 20B, or maybe even 20C, which is just around the corner, you might notice that some role names have changed. And you might even see some reminders when you're logged into the hub to change the settings of certain users to align better with the new naming conventions. So just be aware that you will likely have that to do if you're upgrading. Let's take a look at some key roles. Well, we're going to look at all of the roles, so let's look at all of the roles. Before we talk about roles, however, one final reminder. A role is a very broad thing. If I say that, well, my colleague Steve, he is a rule author, that means he can be writing any kind of policy for any job I give him, for any process, for any context. It's unlikely to be the case that that's what he needs to do. It may make more sense for me to create, if you will, two folders and say this is the folder for HR policies and this is the folder for discounting policies, and Steve is going to be a rule author, a policy writer for the HR policies, but he's not involved in the other policies, so he doesn't need to have access to that folder. If that makes sense, well, you've pretty much understood what workspaces are. Workspaces are folders that we can give permission to a user to access, and that is related to roles. So Steve can be an author in one folder, and he can be a manager in another, if you like. So when you're building out your model, when you're installing or when you're working with Intelligent Advisor for the first time, it pays to think about this before you start creating them. Imagine what's the best way to create the folders. How many folders do I really need? Folders cannot be nested. You can't have folders inside each other. So you're going to end up perhaps with rather a lot of folders on one level. So think carefully about how many you really actually need, and what is the lowest set of permissions you can give to each of your users. It's always better, in my opinion, to start off with the minimum permissions. You can always open the gates later and give them more, but better that way than giving them too much and then having to recover from people accidentally doing things that they weren't supposed to be doing. So on this little screenshot here, you can hopefully see that there's a user called author. And I mentioned earlier, this is a template user that's actually created for you. And you'll notice that this user has been given the author role on the airline projects, and also something I've imaginatively called the default collection. Actually, I didn't name it. It's given that name automatically. But you'll notice that this author has manager permission only on the default collection. They are not a manager in the airline projects. And they have no mobile role permissions, which we'll talk about in a minute, at all. So this is what I meant by a matrix, where we can say this particular user has this particular permission in this particular folder. And that's probably where you'll have to do most of the work before you start creating them. Think about who needs what. So now we've identified, if you will, a logic behind users' roles and workspaces. Let's talk about the roles that you'll see when you log into the Intelligent Advisor and you decide to create a user. I call this the basic role. I should really probably call it the most important role, is somebody who writes policy, somebody who uses policy modeling to translate your business's or your organization's policies into Word and Excel. That's their job. But notice the second bullet point. It stops there. They don't have permission, if you will, to decide when to make it available to the end users. They don't have the decision power to say, okay, let's make this public. Let's stick it on our website. They don't get that permission. Technically speaking, they don't get permission to either deploy it or activate it. And we'll see how those two break down in just a minute. Notice the specifics at the end of the second bullet point. They can deploy it, but they can't activate. This is a little bit of a, it always makes me smile. It's like, we let you deploy it, but the deployment doesn't do anything. So in a sense, you can say that you're ready to deploy, but somebody else has to take it from there. So it's like submitting it for delivery, if you use a different terminology from a different piece of software. So I can get as far as saying, hello, I think I'm done now, but I can't go any further. There is one caveat though. The third bullet point introduces a feature called the collaboration license. And we'll talk about that in a later module. But it's an optional feature. And that optional feature gives the author one extra permission, if you will. It allows them to store ongoing versions, so version 1, version 2, version 3, and so on, in a special location called the repository. Basically what that means is you could create, with the collaboration license, almost two tracking systems. You have a tracking system for the rule writers so that they can keep track of the development work that they're doing. So they can say, well, it's Friday, I'm going home, so I'm going to save version 1 of my work on the server, and I'll pick it up on Monday morning and I'll begin working on version 2. So if you're familiar with other software, this sounds very much like the idea of creating a development version or a development checkpoint. So you say, right, I think I've finished what you asked me to do, so I consider this to be version 3, and this is the next version that I'm going to give to you. And we'll call that the development stream. That development stream is available with the collaboration license. The second stream, which I'm going to call the deployment stream, is available to everyone, whether or not you have the collaboration license. And that is this concept of making your work accessible to the end users, to the public, to the citizens, to your employees, whoever it is. that also will need to be versioned. That also will need to have version 1, version 2, version 3. It will need to be tracked. We'll need to know what version's coming next. What does it contain? What are the changes compared to the previous version? A lot of that work will need to be done by you, and you'll need to know when is the right time to deploy. All those things impact an author, because obviously the author is the source of the work that becomes the deployment, but the author can do nothing more than say, oh, well, I'm pretty much done here, so somebody else needs to take it forward. We'll look at all of that in the demo. Well, kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that if the author can get as far as saying, I think I'm ready now, we need somebody, another role, to take it from there. So you can say that the manager role, in a sense, I'm starting with the bottom bullet point, the manager is the author role plus the ability to actually deliver something. So it picks up where the author left off and moves it on a little bit further. So in the deployment flow, the manager actually gets to make it available to the end users, actually gets to make it available to the end public, to the general public, if that's the case. Notice the second bullet point. It's quite common to see a API client user have this role. Because imagine you are a programmer and you are able to automate certain things, writing code. One of the things you're likely to want to automate as part of your continuous integration and continuous delivery is you want to automate delivery, so that if the rule author has said to you, hey, I think I'm finished my work now, you probably don't want to have to log into the hub, search through the stuff, find the thing, click the button. After a while, you'll want to automate that. So the manager role is a good target for automation because you could automate delivering the next version. And I'll come right back up to the top now. It says, officially, the manager can deploy and activate projects that are on the hub and can also do it from Oracle Policy Modeling. So you might see a manager going to a PC and logging into Oracle Policy Modeling, or you might find them opening a website and going to the Oracle Intelligent Advisor Hub. They can achieve the same goal from both places. Well, that's a lot of description, and it'll become a lot clearer when we talk about it in just a second in the demo. The mobile role is much easier to understand. Mobile role is related to end users who have installed the mobile app. So the two are tied very closely together. This is also license-based. You don't have to buy the mobile license. Maybe you don't have any users who actually have the need to go out of the office with a tablet and need to work on that tablet using a mobile app. It's quite okay. There's plenty of business scenarios that don't need that. But if you have users who leave the office, who are equipped, for example, with a tablet, who risk losing connectivity, not having any 4G or 3G, let alone 5G, then it may be that the mobile concept makes sense to you. And those users would need to be mobile users. It gives them permission, and you can see this in the bullet point, to synchronize their app with your hub. Take a step back from that. Let's imagine that Steve has created some rules. I, his manager, I have deployed this as a project. You are about to leave the office with your tablet in your hand. So I say to you, before you leave, make sure you synchronize so that you will be able to see the project carefully written by Steve and delivered by me on your mobile app. Then you can leave the office and work on that project while you're away from the office, even if you're completely out of internet connection range. And when you return to the office, you can then, depending on how it's been configured, depending on the kind of connectivity you have with other applications, you could even maybe upload the work that you did while you were offline into your CX application. So the mobile is a very specific use case, and if you don't need it, you're never going to check the box. Now we come on to the big guns. This is clearly not a role that I would give to lots of people. Not one, but I wouldn't give it to a whole raft of people. It gives that individual permission to Basically create new things on the hub for administrative purposes. Create new users, create new workspace, give new permissions, change roles, change workspace roles, adjust URLs, upload certificates. It basically is all the back office admin that makes Intelligent Advisor work. Notice the second point. This is also a good target for automation. Some customers regularly have to create new users. So instead of laboriously logging into the website, clicking create and creating a user, they actually have an automated script that connects to the hub using a programming interface, using an API client that has the hub administrator role. They create the user in an automated fashion. It's unique in the sense that it gives you permission to create other users. So it's almost like the seed behind everything else, which explains why when you install Intelligent Advisor, the only active user you have has this role, because you need to be able to create other users. These two I've put on a separate slide because I don't think that they deserve a slide of their own. Not that they're not useful, it's just that they're quite easy to understand. They are both only available to API clients, and they both have very specific use. If you are planning an integration, for example, between Intelligent Advisor and Oracle Digital Assistant or another chat client, you will need to have at least one API user that has this role. It gives them permission to generate output which is used by the digital assistant. So it's basically, this is what makes the integration between Intelligent Advisor and Digital Assistant actually work. The second one is a little less clear perhaps, but it gives access to the web services. What are the web services? By that I mean web services that are administrative, web services that are used, web services that are used to execute policy models without a graphical user interface. So if Steve's created a policy model to calculate the number of days vacation that you're allocated this year, I could call it using a SOAP web service or a JSON web service, a REST web service, and retrieve the answer without having to use a graphical user interface. So whenever you have Intelligent Advisor integrated to another application, one of the common things you'll see is that application requesting from Intelligent Advisor the number of vacation days and receiving that information without there ever being an HTML user interface. It's all going to be behind the scenes in either XML or in JavaScript objects. As I said right at the beginning, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning it now because you're probably reaching the point where you're thinking any more detail and I'm going to cry, is there is in the documentation a very long matrix, which I've just taken a sort of tiny snippet of, that illustrates in great detail, and you can probably see right at the top here, you have the users along, the roles along the top, and you have the functions on the left-hand side. So you can say that, okay, well, if I'm an author, I get to do all of this stuff, whatever that is. I get to get a working copy, I get to view the repository, but I don't get that if I'm an API client with the Determinations API role. So it's the ultimate guide to what functionality is related to what role. So that can be very useful if you need it. Coming up in this demonstration, we're going to look at users and roles. We're going to talk about workspaces, deployment, and repository. Just an overview of what that represents from a day-to-day basis. And we'll use both the Hub application and we'll use the policy modeling application as well. So in that demo, we took perhaps more time than we normally would have done in a demo, but we need to show and we need to understand the difference between a user, a role, and a workspace, and how they are all grouped together under this term of permissions in Intelligent Advisor. Before we move on to the next chapter, it's worthwhile summarizing not just that, but also that you will need to think carefully about how many workspaces, how many users, what are the names of the users? Are you going to use prefixes so that people remember that this is the user they use when they're in development or in test or in production? Notice the third point. One of the things that always frustrates me is that I go to a customer and I see dozens of users and I ask the question, okay, who's Bob 3 or Steve 6 or whatever the user's called? They say, oh, we don't need that anymore. We created it a while ago for XYZ reason. Well, if you don't need it, disable it, remove it, shut it down. The more users you create with the more permissions, sooner or later, something's going to happen that you weren't expecting. Notice the last main bullet point. Some of you may be working with Oracle Identity Cloud Service. Identity Cloud Service, as its name suggests, is a service to manage identities. Let me be more specific. In an Intelligent Advisor world, you can decide to manage your users and passwords in this external service. And when you do that, essentially the users are no longer created in Intelligent Advisor, they're created in Identity Cloud Service, but the mechanics that you saw in the demonstration of selecting a user, giving them a permission, creating a workspace, assigning a project to a workspace, that all still happens in the hub. The Identity Cloud Service is only responsible for handling the usernames and the passwords. That's it. See you in the next module.